Empire of Blood. Episode 13. God, Glory, and the Art of Burning Bridges. Hernán Cortés and the Destruction of the Aztec World. The city is on fire. Not metaphorically. Not as an expression used by generals describing a battle going badly. Not as a poet's shorthand for revolution. The city of Tenochtitlan, the greatest city in the Western Hemisphere, a place of floating gardens and soaring pyramids and aqueducts that carried clean water across a lake for 6 miles, a place that had taken 2 centuries and the labor of 100,000 human beings to construct, is burning. And Hernán Cortés is standing at the edge of it, watching. It is August 13th, 1521, a Tuesday. The siege has lasted 75 days. In those 75 days, Cortés has done something that no general in the Americas had ever attempted on this scale. He has systematically strangled a living city. He has cut the causeways. He has blockaded the canals. He has destroyed the aqueduct. He has positioned brigantines on the lake. Small, flat-bottomed warships he had ordered, built in pieces, carried over the mountains and assembled on the water, and used them to interdict every canoe bringing food or medicine or fresh water into the island city. He has, for 75 days, simply waited for the city to die. The smell is the first thing his soldiers will describe when they write about this day. Not the sight, not the sound, the smell. Death and smoke and the particular sweetness of a city that has been running out of food for weeks. The marketplace at Tlatelolco, which had been one of the great commercial centers of the known world, 60,000 traders, a space larger than the main square of Seville, judges walking the aisles to ensure fair pricing, is silent. The canals, which once moved gold and cacao and cotton and obsidian blades between the Chinampas, run dark with things no one is naming. Cortés is 36 years old. He is not physically imposing. Contemporaries describe him as compact, dark-eyed, with a thin beard, and the kind of stillness that reads as either deep calm or suppressed violence, depending on the observer. There is very little in the contemporary accounts that suggests he was ever fully relaxed. He was always watching, always calculating, always reading the room and adjusting. Even now, so with the greatest military achievement in the history of Spanish colonialism spread out in front of him, with the smoke rising from what was 3 months ago one of the most beautiful cities anyone alive had ever seen, he is still. He watches. He notes. Somewhere in the wreckage of the great market district, a group of Aztec warriors are being dragged out of the rubble by Tlaxcalan fighters. The Tlaxcalans are not being gentle. They have been waiting years for this. The flower wars, the ritual conflicts by which the Aztecs harvested Tlaxcalan captives for sacrifice to Huitzilopochtli, are over. The tribute demands are over. The Aztec Empire, which had pressed its heel onto the neck of Tlaxcala for a century, is over. The Tlaxcalans know what they want to do with this moment, and they are doing it. And Cortés sees and does not intervene. But when somewhere in the smoke there is a woman running. We do not know her name. We know she was running because a Franciscan friar named Bernardino de Sahagún spent decades after the conquest moving through the ruins of the Aztec world, talking to survivors, learning Nahuatl with the obsessive dedication of a scholar who understood that the entire memory of a civilization was about to die with the last generation that carried it, and he wrote down what they told him in a document called the Florentine Codex. In the Florentine Codex, ordinary people surface, not just emperors and warriors and priests, ordinary people, a woman running through the smoke, calling a name. What the name was, we do not know. What she was holding in her arms, and whether she was still holding it, we do not know. Cortés does not record her. and in his famous letters to King Charles V of Spain, 5 long dispatches that he wrote during and after the conquest, documents of extraordinary literary cunning and political self-promotion. Cortés records logistics. He records structural damage. He records his estimates of enemy casualties. He records his own losses, which are minor relative to what his allies have suffered. He records his plans for rebuilding. He is, in his letters, always already planning the next thing. The woman in the smoke is not in any plan. She never was. This is the essential thing to understand about Hernán Cortés, and we are going to spend a long time understanding it today. Not his bravery, not his cruelty. It is not the extraordinary contingency of circumstances that allowed 500 Spanish soldiers and their indigenous allies to bring down an empire of 5 million people. The essential thing is this. He was the most forward-facing man in a world full of forward-facing men. While other conquistadors were still dreaming about gold, Cortés was already designing governance structures. While other commanders were celebrating victories, he was drafting the logistics of the next campaign. He burned his own ships on the coast of Veracruz, literally burned them, scuttled them, reduced them to wreckage on a beach, not in a fit of romantic passion, but as a cold management decision. No going back, no option but forward. He was the man who locked the door from the inside and then hid the key. By the time the last Aztec emperor, the young, unbowed Cuauhtémoc, was captured in a canoe trying to flee across the lake, the empire that had dominated central Mexico for a century was not weakened, not diminished, not reduced. It was gone. The population of Tenochtitlan, which in 1519 had been somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 people, making it one of the 5 largest cities in the world, larger than London, larger than Madrid, larger than any city north of the Alps, was in ruins. Tens of thousands lay dead in the streets and the canals and the rubble of demolished temples. The survivors who remained were so weakened by starvation and disease that several days passed before they could be moved. Cortés ordered the ruins cleared. He commissioned the demolition of what remained of the Aztec ceremonial district, and he used the stones of the Templo Mayor to begin building a Spanish cathedral. The cathedral is still there. It is one of the most beautiful buildings in Mexico City. It took nearly 3 centuries to complete. It sits directly on top of the ruins of the Templo Mayor, and through glass windows set into the plaza floor around it, you can look down and see the foundations of the pyramid below, the coiled stone serpents, the offering pits, the worn steps that priests climbed for 100 years, carrying the hearts of sacrificial victims toward the sun. One world on top of another world, one religion built on the ruins of another. That is what Hernán Cortés made. Today, we are going to find out how. The world before he arrived. To understand what Cortés destroyed, you have to first understand what was there, and what was there. And in the Valley of Mexico in the early 16th century was one of the most remarkable political and cultural achievements in human history. Not that you would know it from the Spanish accounts. They had an obvious interest in describing the civilization they were dismantling as savage and primitive and in desperate need of Christian redemption. But the buildings gave them away. Buildings do not lie as easily as men. When the Spanish soldiers crossed the mountains into the Valley of Mexico in November 1519 and saw Tenochtitlan for the first time, stretched out across the surface of Lake Texcoco like a dream of a city, several of them stopped writing military dispatches and started writing poetry. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, a professional soldier who was not given to flights of sentiment, recorded in his memoir that he and his companions stood at the crest of the mountains and looked down and simply could not believe what they were seeing. He compared it to the enchanted cities described in the romantic novels of the time, the books of Amadis, the equivalent of the high fantasy of his day, and said that it did not seem real. He said it seemed like something conjured. It was a city built on water. The Mexica, the people the Spanish would come to call Aztecs, though they never called themselves that, had founded Tenochtitlan in the mid-14th century on a small, unpromising island in the middle of Lake Texcoco, in what is now the geographic center of Mexico City. According to their founding myth, they had been searching for this place for generations, wandering southward from their original homeland in the north, guided by the prophecy that they would found their great city where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. They found the sign on a small island covered in nopal cactus in the middle of a lake, and they stopped there and began to build. What they built over a century and a half was extraordinary by any measure. They expanded the island by constructing chinampas, artificial floating gardens made by dredging mud from the lake bottom and packing it onto reed frameworks, extending the city gradually outward into the water until the island was several times its original size. They built 3 great causeways connecting the island to the mainland, one to the north, one to the south, one to the west. They built an aqueduct system, 2 parallel pipes of fired clay, so that one could be cleaned while the other remained in service, that brought fresh water from the springs at Chapultepec, 6 miles away. They built a dike 14 miles long across the eastern section of the lake to manage water levels and control salinity. They engineered a system so sophisticated that modern hydraulic engineers have described it with something approaching awe. The city had streets, a grid, a sewer system. The central ceremonial district was dominated by the Templo Mayor, a great double pyramid rising to nearly 200 feet, faced in plaster painted white so that it gleamed in the high-altitude sun, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, the god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and water. In front of it stood a rack of skulls, the Tzompantli, where the heads of sacrificial victims were displayed. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 20th century found the Tzompantli and discovered it was larger than any Spanish account had suggested. Over 600 skulls, and evidence that the structure had held many thousands more. The great market at Tlatelolco was the commercial and social center of the empire. 60,000 people moved through it every day, according to Spanish estimates. And the Spanish had seen the markets of Seville and Toledo, and had nothing to compare it to. You could buy cacao, which was used as currency as well as food. You could buy jade and obsidian and gold worked into objects of extraordinary refinement. You could buy live animals, turkeys, dogs bred specifically for eating, birds whose feathers were used to make the elaborate ceremonial cloaks of the nobility. You could buy medicine, you could buy labor, or you could buy everything a complex urban civilization required to function. There were judges whose sole job was to walk through the market and enforce fair pricing. There was a lost and found building. There were courts for the resolution of commercial disputes. The market was a legal institution, not merely a commercial one. Hernán Cortés, in his second letter to King Charles V, described the market of Tlatelolco and said flatly that it was better organized than anything in Spain. He said there were more people there in a single day than in the entire city of Salamanca, which was one of the most substantial cities in Iberia. He was not being generous, he was being accurate. The architecture of Aztec power. The empire that governed this city, that the city in turn governed, was not, by modern standards, what we would call a centralized state. It was something more elegant and more brittle. The Aztec Empire was what political scientists call a hegemonic empire, a system of dominance relationships rather than direct control. When the Aztecs conquered a city-state, they generally did not replace its local rulers with Aztec administrators. They left the rulers in place, demanded tribute, and required military cooperation. This was efficient. It was also a structural vulnerability. The tribute system was comprehensive and crushing. Subject peoples were required to provide food, textiles, precious materials, craft goods, and, crucially, human captives for sacrifice. The demands were recorded in tribute lists, carefully maintained documents that specified exactly what each subject community owed and when it was due. Historians working from these lists have calculated the scale of extraction: hundreds of thousands of tons of food, millions of pieces of cloth, thousands of kilograms of precious metal every year. The empire was, at its core, a machine for the conversion of human labor into tribute flowing toward the center. The peoples who paid this tribute did not pay it happily. The Tlaxcalans, a confederation of city-states to the east of the Valley of Mexico, had been fighting the Aztecs for decades and had never been fully conquered. Their independence was partly geographic. The Tlaxcalan Plateau was defensible, and the Aztecs had found the cost of total conquest higher than the expected tribute was worth, and partly the result of a peculiar Aztec military logic. To the flower wars, Xochiaoyotl, were ritually scheduled conflicts designed to produce captives for sacrifice rather than territorial conquest. They required an enemy. The Tlaxcalans were useful as enemies. A fully conquered Tlaxcala would have been more trouble than it was worth. This calculation would prove catastrophic. When Cortés arrived on the coast in 1519, the Tlaxcalans were not grateful allies of Spain waiting to be liberated. They were a proud, militarized, deeply resentful people who had spent generations watching their warriors dragged to Tenochtitlan for sacrifice, who had paid tribute in blood to the sun god of a civilization they had every reason to hate. Cortés would offer them something very simple and very powerful: revenge. The biological bomb. There is a variable in the conquest of Mexico that no amount of military analysis can fully account for, and that variable is disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been biologically isolated from the Old World for somewhere between 15 and 20,000 years. In that time, they had not been exposed to the epidemic diseases that had circulated through European, African, and Asian populations: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera, plague. Exposure to these diseases over many generations had produced a degree of immunological resistance in Old World populations. Not immunity exactly, but the accumulated result of generation after generation of exposure, of children who survived infection passing on their genetic and immunological inheritance, of populations that had, at enormous cost in suffering and death, developed some capacity to cope with these pathogens. The peoples of the Americas had none of this. They were, in immunological terms, virgin populations, populations whose immune systems had never encountered these specific challenges and had therefore developed no defenses against them. When smallpox arrived in Mesoamerica, it did not spread like a normal epidemic. It spread like fire through dry grass. It killed people who had no word for it, no medicine for it, no framework for understanding what it was or how it moved. It killed people who were tending to their sick neighbors without knowing that proximity was fatal. It killed healers first, because healers were the ones closest to the sick. The first smallpox epidemic in Mesoamerica arrived in 1520, before the final siege of Tenochtitlan, or in the crucial months between the Night of Sorrows and Cortés's reconquest. It was carried by a soldier in a relief force sent from Cuba. It spread with extraordinary speed from the coast into the interior. Cuitlahuac, the Aztec Emperor who had replaced the imprisoned Moctezuma, and who had successfully driven the Spanish out of Tenochtitlan in June 1520, died of smallpox in October 1520. He had been emperor for 80 days. His successor, the young Cuauhtémoc, inherited an empire already in catastrophic biological crisis. The demographic consequences of the diseases introduced by contact, not just the first epidemic, but the sequence of epidemics that followed, wave after wave over the next century, are almost impossible to comprehend in their scale. If the most carefully considered modern estimates suggest that the population of central Mexico fell from somewhere between 15 and 25 million people in 1519 to approximately 1 million people by 1600. That is not a rounding error. That is not a margin of scholarly uncertainty. That is a collapse, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in the documented history of any civilization anywhere on Earth. Cortés did not introduce the smallpox intentionally. No one did. This is not a story of biological warfare. That concept would not have been intelligible to anyone involved. The virus moved because viruses move. But the conquest created the conditions for contact, and contact created the conditions for transmission, and the result was a biological catastrophe that made every military and political calculation obsolete. The Aztec Empire did not fall to 500 Spanish soldiers. It fell to 500 Spanish soldiers, 100,000 indigenous allies, and a pathogen that neither side could see. The world Spain had made Spain in 1519 was a nation in the grip of an extraordinary collective intoxication. Columbus had returned from his first voyage just 27 years earlier. In those 27 years, the Spanish had colonized the Caribbean archipelago, extracted quantities of gold that would have seemed fantastical to any European a generation earlier, and begun the systematic dismantling of every indigenous civilization they encountered. The Taíno people of Hispaniola, estimated at between 400,000 and 1 million people at the time of first contact, had been reduced to near extinction by 1519. Worked to death in gold mines, he killed in reprisal for resistance, devastated by disease. Entire islands had been depopulated. This was not a secret. It was widely known. The Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas, who had himself owned indigenous laborers in the Caribbean before undergoing a conversion of conscience in 1514, was already beginning the documentation of atrocities that would eventually become his brief account of the destruction of the Indies. The Spanish crown was receiving reports. Officials in Hispaniola were writing letters. Everyone who was paying attention knew what the colonization of the Caribbean had produced. And Spain sailed west anyway, because the gold was real, and the souls to be saved were real, and the glory was real, and the people being destroyed were not Spanish. And that made all the calculations come out differently. Firmed the legal framework for colonization was the encomienda system, which the Crown had developed over the previous 2 decades as a way of organizing the extraction of indigenous labor. An encomendero, a Spanish colonist who had been granted an encomienda, had the right to demand labor and tribute from a specified number of indigenous people. In exchange, the encomendero had the nominal obligation to protect those people, house them, feed them, and convert them to Christianity. The obligation was theoretical. The extraction was practical. The gap between theory and practice was the space in which hundreds of thousands of people were worked to death. Hernán Cortés was a product of this world in the most fundamental sense. He arrived in the Caribbean in 1504. He received an encomienda. He worked it. He absorbed the moral framework of his civilization. the framework that treated indigenous lives as raw material to be processed into Spanish wealth. Not consciously or cynically, but naturally, the way a fish absorbs water without noticing that it is wet. He was not unusual in this. What was unusual about Cortés was the scale at which he was willing to apply this framework and the intelligence and determination with which he pursued it. 2 expeditions and a commission. In 1517 and 1518, Spanish explorers made 2 probing voyages along the coast of Mesoamerica. They came back with stories that were extraordinary, even by the already extraordinary standards of Caribbean exploration. Stone buildings, organized cities, complex social hierarchies, people wearing worked gold. Hernández de Córdoba, who led the first expedition, she was killed in a skirmish with the Maya. Juan de Grijalva, who led the second, came back with gold and reports of a great empire in the interior, a place called Mexico. Diego Velázquez, the governor of Cuba, understood immediately what this meant. He began organizing a 3rd expedition, larger and better equipped. He chose Cortés to lead it, partly because Cortés was energetic and capable and had shown himself to be effective in the administrative work of the Cuba colony, and partly because Velázquez believed he could control him. He had been wrong about that last point before, and he would be wrong again. Cortés threw himself into the preparations with the intensity of a man who understood that this was the moment his entire life had been building toward. He recruited aggressively. He spent his own money and borrowed more. And he gathered ships and weapons and horses and men with the focused energy of someone who is not planning on coming back to ask for more. By the time Velázquez realized that his chosen commander had developed ambitions that exceeded the commission, it was too late. Cortés had momentum. He had men. He had ships loaded and ready. When Velázquez revoked the commission, Cortés received the news and sailed anyway. He was in breach of authority before he left the harbor. He was, by any legal definition, a criminal acting without sanction, and everything he did next would be justified, in the logic of his world, by what he found on the other side. A miner boy from the dry country, Hernán Cortés was born in 1485 in the town of Medellín, in the region of Extremadura in the west of Spain. If you have never been to Extremadura, the name tells you most of what you need to know. It means something like extreme hardship, or beyond hardship, or the edge of the harsh country. It is a land of cork oak and scrub and red dust, hot enough in summer to crack the earth, cold enough in winter to be genuinely dangerous at altitude. It is beautiful in the way that difficult things are beautiful. The beauty of a place that does not apologize for what it is. Extremadura produced an extraordinary number of conquistadors. Francisco Pizarro, who destroyed the Inca Empire 20 years after Cortés destroyed the Aztec one, was from the Extremaduran city of Trujillo. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, who crossed the Isthmus of Panama and became the first European to see the Pacific Ocean from the New World, was Extremaduran. Francisco de Orellana, ein who navigated the entire length of the Amazon River in a journey that should by any rational calculation have been fatal, was Extremaduran. Pedro de Valdivia, who conquered Chile, was Extremaduran. The pattern is not a coincidence. Extremadura was a region with few economic opportunities, a strong military tradition inherited from the Reconquista, and a population of young men who had absorbed the message that the world beyond the horizon was full of things that could be taken by the brave. Cortés's father, Martín Cortés de Monroy, was a soldier. His mother, Catalina Pizarro Altamirano, a distant relative of the Pizarro family that would produce Francisco, was the daughter of a minor noble household. The family was Hidalgo, the lowest rank of the Spanish nobility. which meant they had a coat of arms and were exempt from certain taxes and could not be imprisoned for debt, but which also meant they had essentially no money. The Hidalgo class was one of the most psychologically interesting phenomena in Spanish history, a class defined entirely by honor and precedence and lineage, inhabiting a status that required the performance of dignity, while often living in conditions that were difficult to distinguish from poverty. To be Hidalgo was to be too proud to trade and too poor to inherit. The result was a class of men who had no option but to seek their fortune through military service. Cortés was, according to his early biographers, a sickly child, thin, pale, prone to fevers, not the robust physical specimen that the culture expected its warriors to be. So his biographer, Francisco López de Gómara, who was Cortés's personal secretary in his later years and therefore not an entirely unbiased source, describes him as frail and frequently ill in childhood, and then describes him growing into a man of notable physical courage. This transformation, the sickly boy who becomes the fearless soldier, is one of the standard narrative moves of hagiographic biography, and we should be careful about accepting it uncritically. But there is something in it worth noting. Men who are physically small or constitutionally fragile in cultures that prize physical strength tend to develop compensatory strategies. They become readers of rooms and characters. They become students of leverage and psychology. They learn to win through means other than brute force, and then they apply those means with the intensity of people who spent years discovering that they had to. Salamanca and the education he did not finish. At 14, Cortés was sent to study at the University of Salamanca. This was a significant investment for a family of modest means. Salamanca was the oldest and most prestigious university in Spain, founded in 1218, a center of law and theology in the Renaissance humanism that was then transforming European intellectual life. The plan, presumably, was that Cortés would become a lawyer, which was one of the few respectable careers available to a Hidalgo who could not afford military equipment or a church career. He spent 2 years there. He did not finish his degree. The accounts of why he left vary depending on the source. But the consistent thread is that he was simply unable to sit still. He was living in a world where men were sailing west and coming back with gold and stories that sounded like the books of Amadis come to life, and he was sitting in a library in Salamanca studying contract law. The gap between the world available to the adventurous and the world available to the merely educated was, for a young man of Cortés's temperament, insupportable. But Salamanca left its mark on him in ways that the course of his later life would make unmistakable. He learned to argue. He learned the rhetorical structures of legal persuasion. He learned how institutions worked, how authority was derived, how it was transferred, how it could be manufactured from thin air through the correct deployment of legal language. This would prove to be one of the most consequential educations in the history of colonial America, because Cortés would later use those 2 years of incomplete legal training to engineer one of the most audacious jurisdictional maneuvers in history, the founding of Villarrica de la Vera Cruz, the act by which he turned his illegal expedition into a legal one by the simple mechanism of creating a municipality that could grant him the authority he needed. He was, before anything else, a lawyer who had decided that the law was a tool rather than a constraint. The Caribbean years, learning the shape of exploitation. He left Salamanca and spent several restless years in Extremadura, living with his parents, absorbing the stories coming back from the New World, making plans he could not yet execute. Thus he was 19 when he finally sailed for Hispaniola in 1504. He had been trying to leave for at least 2 years. There is a story, told by Gómara, treated with appropriate skepticism by historians. That his departure was delayed by an injury sustained while climbing out of a window after a romantic encounter, that he fell and hurt himself and was unable to sail on the ship that left without him. Whether this particular story is true or not, it has the texture of something Cortés would have found amusing about himself. A man always halfway over a wall, always caught between appetite and consequence, always landing badly and getting up and going anyway. Hispaniola, in 1504, was a place in the process of being destroyed. So the Taíno people were dying at a rate that even the Spanish officials responsible for managing the colony were beginning to find alarming, not from moral concern, but from practical concern. The labor force was disappearing faster than it could be replaced, and without labor, the gold stopped flowing. Cortés arrived in this environment and absorbed its lessons. He received an encomienda. He worked it. He participated as a landowner and a citizen of the colony in the system of extraction that was converting indigenous people into Spanish wealth. He was not special in this. He was ordinary. He was doing what everyone around him was doing in the framework that his civilization had provided. What distinguished him, even in these early years, was his attention. He watched how the system worked, and he watched how authority was distributed and how it could be shifted. He watched which men prospered and which men failed, and he began to form conclusions about the difference. The men who prospered were not necessarily the bravest or the strongest or even the most ruthless. They were the men who understood the political environment and adapted to it, who knew when to push and when to wait, who could read the calculations of the men above them and stay one step ahead. Cortés was, in these years, becoming a student of power. Cuba and the conquest of the conquistador. When Diego Velázquez organized the conquest of Cuba in 1511, Cortés joined the expedition. The conquest was swift and brutal. The indigenous peoples of Cuba, a mix of Taíno and Siboney, were overwhelmed with the combination of military force, disease, and simple shock. The most famous episode of the Cuba conquest is the capture and execution of a Taíno chief named Hatuey, who had fled from Hispaniola specifically to warn the Cubans about the Spanish and organize resistance. When the resistance failed and Hatuey was captured and sentenced to be burned alive, a Franciscan friar came to him at the stake and offered him baptism and the promise of heaven. Hatuey asked the friar whether there were Spanish people in heaven. The friar said yes. Hatuey declined the baptism and said he preferred not to go where he might encounter them. Cortés was there for all of this. He was there for the burning. He was there for the reduction of the Cuban indigenous population into the same state of servitude that had already consumed Hispaniola. He was, by any moral accounting, complicit. He was also, by his own accounting, simply a man of his time doing what his time required. This is not an exculpation. It is a description of the mechanism by which ordinary people participate in extraordinary evil. Not through exceptional wickedness, but through the steady maintenance of a moral framework that excludes certain categories of people from the universe of those whose suffering counts. In Cuba, Cortés distinguished himself in two ways. First, he proved to be genuinely effective as a military commander and colonial administrator. He was appointed alcalde mayor, a position combining judicial and executive authority, in the new city of Santiago de Baracoa, and he managed the affairs of the colony with unusual competence. Second, he managed to get into significant political trouble. The nature of the trouble is partially obscured by competing accounts, but the core of it was a conflict with Velázquez. Cortés was accused, the specifics vary by source, of either participating in or failing to prevent an indigenous uprising, or of some combination of political insubordination. He was arrested. There are stories of his escaping from confinement by loosening a window grating, of his being recaptured, of his eventually making peace with Velázquez through a combination of negotiation and strategic marriage to a woman from Velázquez's social circle. The marriage was useful. The recaptured escapee was not exactly in a position to negotiate from strength, and aligning himself with a woman connected to the governor's household was a way of creating a social bond that might complicate any decision to have him punished severely. But the relationship between Cortés and Velázquez was never repaired in any deep sense. They needed each other. Velázquez needed men of ability, and Cortés needed the patronage of the man who controlled Cuba. But they never trusted each other. The mutual suspicion was the tension that would eventually snap, sending Cortés into the breach with no authority except what he could manufacture for himself on the other side. The expedition that should not have been, when Velázquez commissioned Cortés to lead the third expedition to Mesoamerica in 1518, he was making a calculated gamble. He knew Cortés was ambitious and difficult. He believed, or told himself, that the commission came with sufficient constraints to keep him manageable. Instructions that limited the expedition to exploration and trade, that required him to report back to Velázquez, that made clear that any discoveries would accrue to the governor's benefit. He believed, in other words, that the institutional framework was strong enough to contain the man. He was wrong. The moment Cortés had the commission in hand, he began converting it into something else. He recruited beyond the specified numbers. He spent money that was not his to spend, borrowing against future profits that did not yet exist. He generated excitement and momentum and personal loyalty in a way that made the commission less the source of his authority and more an excuse for it. By the time Velázquez decided to cancel the expedition already existed, in the minds and plans and personal investments of 500 men who had pledged themselves to Cortés, not to Velázquez. So Cortés received word of the cancellation and sailed before Velázquez could stop him. He left in February 1519. There are accounts of him stopping at various ports along the Cuban coast to recruit more men, moving quickly, staying one town ahead of the messengers Velázquez was sending to intercept him. He was already operating as if the rules of the institutional world no longer applied to him. He had not yet replaced those rules with anything except his own will, but his will was, as it turned out, sufficient. Vera Cruz. The first legal fiction. The expedition landed on the coast of Mesoamerica in April 1519. The first significant engagement was at the Tabascan town of Potonchan, where Cortés fought a brief battle against local forces. He won, as he would win most of his military engagements in the first phase of the expedition, as through a combination of cavalry. Horses were unknown in Mesoamerica, and their appearance caused genuine terror. Firearms, and the ruthless coordination of an experienced military commander. The Tabascan leaders sued for peace and sent gifts, including 20 enslaved women. Among those women was a young person of Nahuatl and Maya origin, who would be baptized and given the name Marina by the Spanish, who would be called Malintzin by the Nahuatl speakers around her, and who would be known to history as La Malinche. She was, in the most precise sense, the indispensable person of the conquest of Mexico. She spoke Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, and Maya, and Cortés had in his company a Spanish soldier named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked on the Yucatan coast years earlier and had learned Maya during his years of captivity. Through this relay, Cortés to Aguilar in Spanish, Aguilar to La Malinche in Maya, La Malinche to the Aztecs in Nahuatl. Cortés could communicate with the most powerful empire in the Americas. La Malinche is one of the most contested figures of the entire colonial period. She is celebrated in some historical traditions as a woman of exceptional intelligence who navigated impossible circumstances with great skill. She is condemned in others as a traitor whose translation services made the destruction of her people possible. Both assessments carry some truth, and neither carries the whole of it. She was enslaved, so she had been enslaved before the Spanish arrived. She had been sold by her own family or community into slavery at a young age, which was not uncommon in the hierarchical societies of Mesoamerica. She had no meaningful agency over the position she occupied. The role she played in the conquest was not chosen from among available options. It was assigned to her by circumstances that were entirely outside her control. What she did with that role, the intelligence she brought to it, the specific knowledge and contextual understanding she provided that went far beyond simple translation, is something different. Cortés trusted her judgment in ways that go beyond the purely linguistic. She warned him of ambushes. She helped him understand the political dynamics of communities he was negotiating with. So she understood the Aztec court in ways that no Spanish person could have understood it. Without her, the conquest of Mexico is not possible. That is a statement of historical fact, not a moral judgment. The moral complexity of her position is real, and it is hers, and it was not created by any choice she made. At Veracruz, Cortés performed his most audacious legal maneuver. He gathered his men and proposed that they found a municipality. He proposed that this municipality, Villa Rica de la Veracruz, the rich town of the True Cross, formally elect him as its Chief Justice and Captain General, an authority derived not from Velázquez's cancelled commission, but from the municipality itself, which derived its authority from the Spanish crown. He was creating a legal fiction of striking ingenuity by founding a town. And he was deriving authority directly from the king, bypassing the entire intermediate structure that connected him to Velázquez. Whether the king would accept this logic was an open question. The answer to that question was 4,000 miles away in Spain. Cortés had to act now. He sent Charles V a letter. Then he sent him a treasure. The letter was a masterwork of political rhetoric, a 50-page document that framed Cortés's unauthorized expedition as an act of loyal service to the crown, that subtly cast Velázquez as an obstacle to Spain's rightful claim to the riches of the New World, that asked for retroactive authorization for everything Cortés had already done and was about to do. The treasure that accompanied the letter, gold ornaments, jade, featherwork, carved stone, the accumulated gifts of the first months of contact, was so extraordinary that it stopped conversations in the courts of Europe. When it was displayed in Brussels, the German painter Albrecht Dürer wrote in his diary that he had stood before it for a long time and that he had never in his life seen anything that filled his heart with such wonder. Burning the ships. Cortés burned his ships at Veracruz sometime in the summer of 1519. This is one of the most famous acts in the history of military leadership, and it has been repeated and romanticized so many times that it is difficult to see it clearly. Strip away the romance, and what you have is a management decision of cold precision. There were men in his force who wanted to go back. Some had been privately in contact with Velázquez's representatives in Cuba. Some were simply frightened. They had seen the size and organization of Mesoamerican civilization up close now, had begun to understand the scale of what Cortés was proposing, and had done their own arithmetic. The ships were not merely a means of transport. They were an option. They were the possibility of retreat. As long as the ships existed, the question of whether to continue was alive. Cortés killed the question. He ordered his captains to find holes in the hulls, to report to him that the ships were worm-eaten, unseaworthy, unfit for the voyage back to Cuba. He then convened a meeting at which he solemnly announced that, given the condition of the ships, they would have to be scuttled. The men knew what this was. Most of them accepted it anyway, either because they were genuinely committed to the enterprise, or because they had already invested too much to turn back, or because they understood that Cortés was the kind of man whose plans it was dangerous to obstruct. Some accounts have Cortés giving a speech afterward. The accounts of that speech, Gomara's version in particular, are almost certainly embellished and possibly entirely invented by Cortés himself in his later tellings of the story. But even the legend of the speech reveals something true about Cortés. He understood that men needed a story. They needed to believe that what they were doing was not merely convenient or profitable, but necessary and glorious. He gave them the story they needed. He had, by burning the ships, removed the material option of retreat. He had, with whatever words he used, removed the psychological option. So he had not burned his ships because he was brave. He had burned them because he had already decided there was only one direction, and he needed his men to agree. The psychology of controlled terror. The march from Veracruz to Tenochtitlan is a study in the precise deployment of violence as communication. Cortés was a student of terror. Not terror for its own sake, but terror as a message sent to specific audiences with specific intended effects. Every act of violence he committed on the road inland was, in some sense, a piece of propaganda. The engagements with the Tlaxcalans, 3 battles over several weeks in the autumn of 1519, were fought not primarily to defeat the Tlaxcalans militarily, but to demonstrate to them and to the watching Aztec intelligence network what Spanish military technology could do. Cavalry disrupted Mesoamerican formations in ways that no indigenous military tradition had developed responses to. Firearms were terrifying in their noise and smoke and the impossibility of seeing the projectile. Steel swords and steel armor in close quarters combat gave decisive advantages over obsidian-edged weapons and cotton armor. The Tlaxcalans nearly prevailed through sheer numbers. They had tens of thousands of warriors. Cortés had a few hundred Spanish soldiers. But they didn't, and when they didn't, Cortés reached out with the offer of alliance. The Cholula massacre came next. Cholula was one of the most sacred cities in Mesoamerica, home to the Great Pyramid of Quetzalcoatl, the largest structure by volume in the ancient world, a city of temples and priests and pilgrims from every corner of the Aztec sphere of influence. Cortés was invited in. His Tlaxcalan allies warned him that they had intelligence of a planned ambush, that Moctezuma's agents in Cholula were preparing to attack the Spanish while they were surrounded by a friendly city and their guard was down. Whether the ambush was real, whether Moctezuma had actually sent instructions to the Cholulans to attack, is a question that historians have been arguing about for 5 centuries. The Spanish sources insist it was real. Indigenous accounts are less certain. Modern scholars tend toward skepticism. The evidence Cortés presented was thin, and the subsequent events were so perfectly calibrated to produce maximum terror in the Aztec court that it is difficult to separate the claimed justification from the strategic effect. What happened in Cholula is not disputed. Cortés assembled the Cholulan nobility, the city's leadership class, in the main courtyard of the city under the pretext of a ceremony of departure. When the courtyard was full, when the gates were closed, he gave the signal. His soldiers opened fire. His Tlaxcalan allies attacked from outside. In a matter of hours, somewhere between 3,000 and 6,000 people were dead. The wide range reflects genuinely disputed accounts, but no account puts the number below 3,000. The city was then looted systematically. The temples were burned. And then Cortés marched on toward Tenochtitlan, sending Moctezuma's returning emissaries ahead of him like a message written in blood. Think about what Moctezuma received. And he received the news that the strange army from the east had been invited into one of the holiest cities in his empire and had killed thousands of people in an afternoon and continued marching. He received this news while sitting in the most powerful city in Mesoamerica, surrounded by the evidence of his own strength, and the evidence was somehow not reassuring, because Cholula was also a powerful city. Cholula had not been enough. The prisoner Emperor Cortés arrived at the gates of Tenochtitlan on November 8, 1519. Moctezuma came out to meet him on the great southern causeway, borne on a litter, accompanied by his court, dressed in the extraordinary regalia of the Aztec Emperor. Turquoise mosaic, gold, the iridescent feathers of the Quetzal bird, sandals soled with gold. The meeting of the two men on the causeway is one of the singular moments of the 16th century, and also one of the most thoroughly mythologized. Cortés had been coached, by La Melange, by indigenous intermediaries, on the protocols of Aztec royal greeting. Moctezuma had been receiving intelligence reports about Cortés for months. Each man was performing, for the other and for the audiences watching, a carefully constructed version of what this meeting was supposed to mean. Cortés performed deference and wonder, a Christian soldier amazed by the greatness of a pagan civilization, come in peace and in service to his great king. Moctezuma performed the elaborate welcome of an emperor receiving a notable foreign dignitary, formal, controlled, projecting authority. Within a week, Cortés had taken him prisoner. The pretext was an attack on Spanish soldiers at a coastal garrison. Cortés claimed that Moctezuma had ordered the attack, that this constituted a hostile act requiring a response. Moctezuma denied it. The argument is almost irrelevant, because the arrest was not a response to an incident. It was a strategic decision that Cortés had been working toward from the moment he entered the city. An emperor in his own palace, surrounded by his court and his warriors, was a political authority. An emperor under house arrest in a Spanish-controlled wing of the palace, accessible only through Spanish permission, was a hostage. Moctezuma, in captivity, was required to continue performing the functions of emperor. He received ambassadors, he adjudicated disputes, he issued decrees. All of this was carefully monitored and filtered by Cortés, and who used the captive emperor as a ventriloquist's dummy through which to issue orders that the Aztec administrative apparatus would carry out, because the orders appeared to come from the emperor himself. It was a system of extraordinary cunning, and it worked for approximately 7 months. The Architecture of Conquest. The conquest of the Aztec Empire was not a military operation. That framing is both technically inaccurate and strategically misleading. What Cortés constructed was a system of interlocking mechanisms, each dependent on the others, each generating effects that fed back into the rest of the machine. Military force was one component. Indigenous alliances were another. Disease was another. Legal and administrative architecture was another. The psychology of the conquistadors, their faith, their greed, from their extraordinary capacity for violence framed as virtue, was another. Remove any single component and the system fails. They all had to work together, and under Cortés's direction, for the most critical period, they did. Begin with the military element, because it is the most visible. The Spanish force at maximum strength numbered around 500 soldiers, against tens of thousands of Aztec warriors, in a city purpose-built for defense, surrounded by water. By any conventional military calculus, this is a force that should have been annihilated. That it was not is explained almost entirely by the indigenous allies. The Allied force under Cortés's effective command during the siege of Tenochtitlan numbered somewhere between 75,000 and 200,000 warriors, depending on the source and the moment in the siege. See, the Tlaxcalans were the core of this force, the most experienced, the best organized, the most motivated by the specific grievance of Aztec domination. But there were Totonacs from the Gulf Coast, Texcocans from the eastern side of the lake who had broken with the Aztec Confederacy, former tribute-paying communities from across the empire who had concluded that the Spanish were going to win, and that being on the winning side was preferable to being on the losing one. The conquest of Mexico was, in the most precise sense, a coalition war. The Spanish provided technology, military leadership, and a legal framework. Their indigenous allies provided manpower, local knowledge, and the accumulated grievances of a century of Aztec dominance. The night of sorrow. The machine nearly broke. In June 1520, von Cortés's position in Tenochtitlan had become critical. He had been absent from the city for several weeks, dealing with a military force sent by Velázquez to arrest him on the Gulf Coast. A force Cortés defeated and absorbed, turning most of its soldiers into his own men through a combination of military persuasion and financial incentive. While he was gone, his second-in-command, Pedro de Alvarado, had ordered a massacre at the festival of Tenochtitlan. The festival of Tenochtitlan was one of the great annual religious ceremonies of the Aztec calendar, an 8-day observance involving music, dance, and the sacrifice of an individual who had spent the previous year impersonating the god Tezcatlipoca. Thousands of the Aztec nobility and priesthood gathered in the ceremonial precinct of Tenochtitlan. Alvarado, who was brave, impulsive, and possessed of a capacity for violence that even by conquistador standards was notable, claimed afterward that he had received intelligence of a planned uprising. He ordered the gates of the ceremonial precinct closed while the dancing was ongoing and ordered his soldiers to open fire. The death toll was in the hundreds, perhaps the thousands. The victims were unarmed, dressed for ceremony. They were the religious and social leadership of the empire. The effect on the Aztec population was something beyond outrage. The careful management of the city's compliance that Cortés had been maintaining through the captive Moctezuma was obliterated. When Cortés returned to the city, he found it on the edge of open revolt. Moctezuma was brought to the battlements to address the crowd that was massing below. And he was either killed by the crowd or killed by the Spanish. The accounts disagree, and the disagreement is itself historically significant because both sides had reason to want the story told differently. The Night of Sorrows, La Noche Triste, came on June 30th, 1520. Cortés attempted to withdraw his force from the city at night, crossing the Western Causeway with his soldiers, his guns, his gold, and his remaining indigenous allies. The Aztecs discovered the retreat. Canoes attacked from both sides of the causeway. The causeway was packed with fleeing men, and men fell into the water and drowned, many of them dragged down by the weight of the gold they had looted from the Aztec treasury and refused to abandon. Estimates of Spanish dead range from 450 to 800. Indigenous allied casualties were far higher. An enormous quantity of gold, perhaps the majority of what the Spanish had accumulated during their months in the city, sank to the bottom of Lake Texcoco. Cortés, by several accounts, sat under a great ahuehuet tree on the mainland after the retreat was complete and wept. It is the moment in the historical record where his emotional state is described with the most specificity and the most apparent sincerity. Whether he wept from grief, from shock, from the accumulated weight of command under catastrophic pressure, or from some calculation about the performance that the moment required, we cannot determine. What we can determine is that within 48 hours, he had stopped weeping and started planning, or the reconquest, building the machine. Anew, the months between the Night of Sorrows and the beginning of the final siege, roughly June 1520 to May 1521, are, in some ways, the most revealing period of Cortés's life. He had lost most of his Spanish force. He had lost the city he had occupied for 7 months. He had lost his gold. He was operating in Tlaxcala, dependent on the continued support of allies whose patience was not unlimited, without the legal backing of either Velázquez or the crown, in a situation that any reasonable assessment would have described as catastrophic. He rebuilt the machine from the ground up. He sent to the Caribbean for reinforcements, men, horses, weapons, gunpowder. He maintained and extended his indigenous alliances, making commitments to his Tlaxcalan partners about the post-Aztec political settlement that he may or may not have intended to keep. He designed and built 13 brigantines, shallow draft sailing vessels small enough to operate on Lake Texcoco, but large enough to mount cannons. He had the ships built in pieces, carried by teams of indigenous porters over the mountains, and assembled on the shore of the lake. He commissioned the digging of a channel to float them into position. He organized a supply system, a command hierarchy, an intelligence network. Meanwhile, smallpox was doing the work that no Spanish military campaign could have done. Cuitlahuac, the emperor who had driven Cortés out of the city, was dead. His successor, Cuauhtémoc, young, 20 or 22 years old, and from the warrior aristocracy, inherited an empire that was already biologically collapsing. The epidemic that had arrived with the relief force from Cuba was still running through the population of central Mexico. In Tenochtitlan, people were dying in their houses and in the streets, dying faster than the bodies could be removed, dying in the silence of an illness that no healer had any treatment for and no priest had any explanation of. The city that Cortés would besiege in May 1521 was already, in some clinical sense, a city under siege from within. The siege. Killing a city. The final siege of Tenochtitlan was not a battle. It was an operation of systematic destruction. The deliberate, organized dismantling of a city and everything that sustained it. Cortés had thought carefully about this. He had been in the city, so he knew its geography, its dependencies, and its vulnerabilities. He knew that the island could not be taken by frontal assault. He knew that the causeways were choke points where Spanish military technology was largely neutralized, where the defenders knew the ground and the attackers were exposed. He knew that the only way to take the city was to make the city unlivable. The brigantines took the lake. With cannon and crossbow, they cleared the Aztec canoe fleet from the water and established control of the supply lines. The Spanish and their allies then moved to control the 3 causeways, blockading all 3 simultaneously, which required the full strength of the coalition force. The aqueduct from Chapultepec was identified and destroyed. Fresh water stopped flowing into the city, and Tenochtitlan's population of 200,000 people was now dependent on whatever water could be extracted from the lake. The lake, which was brackish, which had no reliable fresh water in the locations accessible from the city center. Cortés then did something that his officers initially protested and that history has sometimes tried to rationalize away. He ordered the systematic demolition of every building his forces captured as they advanced into the city. Not just the destruction of resistance points, not just the clearing of sniper positions. The buildings themselves, houses, temples, market stalls, the entire physical fabric of the city. were to be demolished as the advance proceeded, so that the rubble could not provide cover for counterattacks, so that the Aztec defenders would lose not just territory, but the city itself. Stone by stone, building by building, as the siege continued. Cuauhtémoc organized the defense with everything available. He had warriors. He had the knowledge of the city's geography. He had the loyalty of a population that had, whatever its doubts about the political situation, chosen to stay and fight rather than flee. He had the example of what had happened to Cholula. He organized the canoe fleet into a fighting force that harassed the brigantines constantly. He organized night counterattacks. He organized the distribution of the remaining food and water. He organized the repair of causeways that the Spanish would advance along during the day, filling in the sections that had been demolished, fighting back the next morning, watching them demolished again. For 75 days, this continued. So the Aztec accounts from the Florentine Codex describe what the city experienced from the inside. The smell of the dead bodies piling up in the streets, the people eating leather and roots and the bark of trees, the children too weak to cry, the warriors who went to their posts every morning, not because they believed they could win, but because there was nothing else to do. The Spanish accounts describe the advance through streets that smelled of death, through rubble that had to be cleared under constant attack, through a city that was fighting its own demolition. Even the Spanish soldiers, hardened men who had seen considerable violence, wrote in their letters home that what they found as they advanced through the city was disturbing in a way that victory did not entirely resolve. Of the fall and the tortured King Cuauhtémoc was captured on August 13th, 1521. He had tried to escape across the lake by canoe, having concluded that the city could no longer be defended and that whatever happened next, the continuation of the Aztec political authority required that the emperor survive. He was intercepted by one of the brigantines. When he was brought before Cortés, he is reported, in both Spanish and Nahuatl sources, to have reached out and touched the dagger at Cortés's belt and said, "I have done everything in my power to defend my city and my people. I can do no more. Kill me with your own hand." Cortés did not kill him. A dead Aztec emperor was worthless. A living one was a political instrument, a source of intelligence about the treasury, that a figure whose continued existence could be used to signal to the Aztec population that the political transition had been managed, rather than simply imposed by violence. Cortés told Cuauhtémoc that he was brave, that he was noble, that his valor was respected, and then he had him imprisoned. Within a few months of the conquest, Cortés had Cuauhtémoc tortured. The reason given was gold. Cortés believed that substantial portions of the Aztec treasury had been hidden, that the gold dumped in the lake during the Night of Sorrows had not been the whole of it, that somewhere in the ruins of Tenochtitlan, or in the memory of its former emperor, was information about where the rest of the wealth was hidden. The method of torture was fire, burning oil or burning coals applied to the feet. Cuauhtémoc endured it. His companion, also being tortured, broke and cried out. Cuauhtémoc, according to the accounts, turned to him and said, "And do you think I am taking my pleasure bath?" Whether this was said, or whether it is the invention of a later tradition building a legend of indigenous resistance, the words have survived because they carry something true. The refusal, under torture, to give his captors the confirmation that they had fully conquered him. Cortés later had Cuauhtémoc hanged. The year was 1525. Cortés was leading a disastrous overland expedition through the jungles of Honduras, a campaign that accomplished nothing except the deaths of many men and the destruction of Cortés's political standing in Mexico. He accused Cuauhtémoc of conspiring with other indigenous nobles to organize a rebellion. The evidence was thin enough that later historians have generally concluded that the accusation was pretextual. that Cortés killed Cuauhtémoc because he had become a liability rather than an asset, because the symbolic weight of keeping the last Aztec emperor alive and ambulatory was becoming a problem. Cuauhtémoc was hanged from a ceiba tree in the jungle and buried there, and his precise burial site was never established with certainty. The encomienda, converting conquest into industry. The conquest produced an empire. Managing an empire required a system. The system Cortés deployed was the encomienda, transplanted from the Caribbean and applied to Mexico at a scale the Caribbean had not approached. An encomienda was, in legal theory, a grant of indigenous labor and tribute, not the land itself, and not the indigenous people as property, but their work and their agricultural production, assigned to a Spanish grantee in exchange for the grantee's obligation to protect, feed, and convert them. The distinction between the encomienda and slavery was legally precise and practically meaningless. Cortés distributed encomiendas to his soldiers as the primary reward for the conquest. The distribution was hierarchical. Officers received more, common soldiers received less, and Cortés himself took the largest grant of all. His encomienda, formalized as the Marquesado del Valle de Oaxaca, was a territory of staggering extent, encompassing portions of what are now the states of Mexico, Morelos, Oaxaca, and Veracruz, with somewhere between 23,000 and 100,000 indigenous tributaries, depending on the estimate. It was the largest private land grant in the history of Spanish colonial America. The encomienda system produced wealth for the encomenderos and misery for the indigenous people subject to it. The tribute demands were tied to pre-conquest Aztec tribute rates, which were themselves crushing, and were then managed by Spanish administrators who had no interest in moderating them for humanitarian reasons. The labor requirements sent men into mines and fields and construction projects under conditions that killed them at rates that alarmed even some of the Spanish officials responsible for enforcing them. The population decline that disease had already begun was accelerated by the encomienda. People died not just from illness, but from overwork, malnutrition, and the systematic disruption of the agricultural and social systems that had sustained Mesoamerican civilization. The theological justification that all of this was in service of the conversion of indigenous souls to Christianity was not merely cynical. The missionaries who came to Mexico in the wake of the conquest, particularly the Franciscans who arrived in 1524, were often genuinely dedicated men who learned Nahuatl with impressive speed, recorded indigenous culture and history with scholarly rigor, built schools, and protested the conditions of the encomienda with courage that put them at personal and professional risk. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, whose Florentine Codex is one of the most important documents of the colonial period, spent decades learning Nahuatl and collecting testimony from indigenous survivors of the conquest. He was not building a monument to Spanish triumph. He was building an archive of what was being destroyed. Bartolomé de las Casas, the Dominican friar, who had himself owned indigenous laborers and who underwent a conversion of conscience in 1514, became the most effective advocate for indigenous rights in the Spanish colonial period. He appeared before Charles V in the Spanish Council of the Indies, argued that the conquest and the encomienda were violations of natural law and Christian ethics, and helped produce the new laws of 1542, which were supposed to reform the encomienda system and prevent the perpetual enslavement of indigenous labor. So the encomenderos in Mexico and Peru reacted with such fury that the laws were largely rescinded within a few years. The reformers had the better argument. The settlers had the power. The self-sustaining system. The most important thing about the colonial machinery that Cortés built is not its violence, The violence was real, was systematic, was on a scale that modern statistics can describe but not fully convey. But the violence of the conquest period was, in a sense, transitional. The violence of a system establishing itself, clearing the ground for what would follow. What followed was worse because it was structural. A system of colonial exploitation does not require constant overt violence once it is established. It requires instead the steady operation of its own rules. The tribute demands and the labor requirements and the legal disabilities and the systematic destruction of alternative power structures, all of which together produce compliance not through the fear of immediate violence, but through the calculation that resistance is too costly to contemplate. The whip is real, but you do not need to use it every day if the architecture of life leaves people no time or energy or coordination capacity for anything but surviving. Cortés built the architecture, not alone. The crown, the church, the merchant class, the subsequent administrators all contributed to its elaboration, but he broke the ground. He demonstrated that the enormous civilization of Mesoamerica could be converted through a combination of military force, biological catastrophe, thus indigenous division, and legal architecture, into a labor system that would feed Spanish wealth for 3 centuries. The silver mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato, discovered in the 1540s and 1550s, would produce more silver than the rest of the world, combined for a period of time. The labor for those mines came from the indigenous population of New Spain, organized through the repartimiento system that grew out of the encomienda. The death rate in the mines was high enough to require constant replenishment of the labor force, constant reaches further into the country for new communities to conscript. The extraction and the dyeing continued, generation after generation, until independence in 1821 ended the formal colonial structure, though not the underlying economic patterns, and which persisted in different forms well into the 20th century. The numbers let us try to be precise about the cost, because precision is the only honest approach to catastrophe of this scale, and because the tendency, when confronting numbers this large, is to abstract them, to let them become a statistic rather than a sum of individual human lives, each one of which was the center of a world. The population of central Mexico in 1519 is estimated by modern demographers at between 15 and 25 million people. The range is wide because the evidence is incomplete. We are working from tribute records, from early colonial censuses that themselves reflect a population already reduced by epidemic disease, from careful analysis of agricultural carrying capacity, and from the accounts of missionaries and administrators whose numbers we have reason to treat with some skepticism. But even the most conservative estimates put the pre-contact population of New Spain in the millions, not the hundreds of thousands, the millions. By 1600, 80 years after contact, the indigenous population of central Mexico had fallen to approximately 1 million people. Some estimates put it lower. No serious scholar puts it higher. The population had fallen by somewhere between 90 and 95% in the course of a single human lifetime. Most of this was disease: smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, in waves, one following another before the survivors of the last had fully recovered. The first major smallpox epidemic arrived in 1520. There were significant subsequent epidemics in 1531, 1545, 1576. The epidemic of 1545, which may have been a hemorrhagic fever, possibly related to salmonella, called cocolistli by the Nahuatl speakers, may have killed between 5 and 15 million people. That one epidemic, in a population already decimated, killed a number of people that exceeds the total dead of the First World War. But disease did not operate independently of conquest. It operated in a population that was already stressed by forced labor, by malnutrition caused by the disruption of traditional agricultural systems, by the psychological trauma of cultural destruction, by the collapse of the social and religious institutions that had organized life and maintained community cohesion. A starving, overworked population is more vulnerable to epidemic disease than a well-nourished, adequately rested one. So the conquest and the epidemics were not parallel catastrophes that happened to coincide. They were a single process. In Tenochtitlan specifically, the siege of 1521 killed somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 people. In the city itself, during the 75 days of systematic destruction, the bodies were piled so thickly in some streets that the Spanish could not advance without walking over them. The smell was such that even the victorious soldiers, who had been through Cholula and the Night of Sorrows and the months of campaigning, found the final advance through the ruins of the city deeply disturbing. Bernal Diaz, who was there, wrote about it with an honesty that credit demands we acknowledge. It was, he said, a terrible thing to behold. The named history gives us some names from this catastrophe, and we should say them. Moctezuma II, the 9th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, who ruled for 18 years and whose mistake, if we must call it that, which is perhaps too simple a word for the failure of every possible strategy in an impossible situation, was to try to manage the Spanish through accommodation rather than to destroy them before they could establish a foothold. He was perhaps 50 years old when he died in June 1520. The manner of his death is one of the genuine historical mysteries of the conquest. The Spanish said he was killed by stones thrown by his own people when he tried to address them from the palace battlements, that they stoned him for being a collaborator. The Nahuatl accounts say the Spanish killed him. The disagreement is not merely academic. If the Spanish killed him, and it removes any vestige of a claim that his death was the choice of his own people. Modern historians tend toward the latter account. Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, who was perhaps 20 to 22 years old when Tenochtitlan fell, who endured the torture of burning oil on his feet without revealing whatever he knew or didn't know about the hidden treasury, who was kept alive as a political hostage for 4 years after the fall of his city, and then hanged in the jungle of Honduras in 1525 on a charge of conspiracy that the historical record does not support with any confidence. His body was buried at the site of his death, and the precise location of his remains has never been definitively established, though a town in Guerrero State claims to have them, and his face is on the coins of the country that was built on the ruins of his world. He is remembered as Cuauhtémoc the Brave. La Malinche, who died sometime in the late 1520s or early 1530s, probably of smallpox after a life that had moved from indigenous slavery to Spanish concubinage to the role of mother of the first notable mestizo in Mexican history. Her son, Martín Cortés, legitimized by his father, given a Spanish education, sent to Spain, lived a long and complicated life as a man caught between two worlds, neither of which fully claimed him. La Malinche herself has been the subject of more ideological projection than almost any other figure in Mexican history. Savior, traitor, victim, collaborator, founding mother, arch-betrayer. She was a person who had no good options and made survival choices in conditions of extreme constraint. The condemnation has outlasted her by 5 centuries, and then there are the unnamed. They are almost all unnamed. The warriors at Cholula who came to a farewell ceremony and were shot in a courtyard. The priests who watched their books burned, centuries of astronomical observation, historical record, religious knowledge, ceremonial instruction, all of it reduced to ash by men who called it the work of the devil, The children in the Florentine Codex, wandering through rubble. The woman running toward the lake, calling a name we do not know. The millions who died in mines over the following century, and whose individual lives and deaths are not in any archive, because archives are built by the powerful, and the powerful had no interest in recording the deaths of the people whose labor was killing them. Cortés. After the conquest. The last 26 years of Cortés's life are the story of a man slowly losing the thing he had spent his life acquiring, not the wealth. He retained the Marquesado del Valle, was technically one of the richest men in New Spain for the rest of his life. Not even entirely. The status. He was still received with ceremony in Spain, was still the famous Hernán Cortés who had conquered Mexico. What he lost was power, actual power, the capacity to direct events, to make decisions that mattered, to be the author rather than the subject of the story. The Spanish crown was not fully grateful. This is one of the consistent ironies of the conquest. Spain was delighted with the result and deeply ambivalent about the people who produced it. Cortés had been, from the beginning, a rogue, a man who had disobeyed his legal commander, engineered his own authority, and presented Spain with a fait accompli. The conquest had worked, and so he was celebrated. But the precedent was alarming. A man who could defy local authority and retroactively claim justification through success was a structural threat to imperial governance. The crown needed the conquest but could not afford the conquistador. Cortés was appointed governor of New Spain in 1522, but the appointment was immediately circumscribed by the installation of a governing committee, the Audiencia, that shared and then progressively absorbed his authority. By the late 1520s, the accusations had begun of murdering his first wife Catalina Suarez, who had died in November 1522 under circumstances that the Spanish legal system never adequately investigated, but that gossip had always treated as suspicious. He was investigated repeatedly. He was never convicted of anything. The investigations themselves were the punishment, the cloud of suspicion that attached itself to him and made every assertion of authority easier to challenge. He mounted 2 more expeditions that cost more than they gained. The overland march to Honduras in 1524 to 1525, an absurd military and logistical undertaking that serves mainly as the occasion for the hanging of Cuauhtémoc, nearly killed him and killed many of his men, accomplished nothing of territorial significance, and was widely understood as a demonstration that Cortés's judgment was impaired by his determination to keep moving, to keep doing, to refuse to sit still, even when sitting still was the right answer. The subsequent Pacific expeditions in the 1530s led to the European discovery of Baja California, which Cortés named California after a fictional island in a Spanish romance novel, and produced no wealth, no settlement, and significant loss of life. He returned to Spain twice. The first time, in 1528, he was received by Charles V with the ceremony due to a famous man, and was granted the Marquesado and the title of Captain General of New Spain, and was given essentially nothing in the way of actual governing authority. The second time, in 1540, but he was received with less ceremony and found that the court had moved on to other concerns and other conquerors. He lingered in Spain for 7 years, fighting legal battles over his estate and his titles, growing older and less relevant, the world he had made running very well without him. He died on December 2nd, 1547, in the village of Castilleja de la Cuesta near Seville, at the age of 62. He was on his way back to Mexico. He had been planning to return to his Marquesado, to see his family, to spend whatever time remained to him in the country he had made. He developed dysentery and could not travel and died in a borrowed house. His will was complex and extensive and took years to adjudicate. He asked to be buried in Mexico, in a convent he intended to found. And his remains were moved 4 times over the following century, before coming to rest at the Hospital de Jesus Nazareno in Mexico City, a hospital he had founded on the spot where he had first met Moctezuma. His bones are still there. They have been hidden twice, once during Mexican independence, when there were serious proposals to dig them up and destroy them, and once in the 1820s, when the hospital staff physically concealed them to prevent their desecration. The location of his remains was secret for many years and was only officially confirmed in 1946. There is a small plaque. It has been vandalized periodically. There is no statue. How memory works. There is no statue of Hernán Cortés in Mexico City. This is worth reflecting on for a moment. And he is the founder of modern Mexico in the most literal possible sense. The man who broke the ground on which the country was built, who established its first colonial institutions, who built the city that became the capital, who in the most physical and unambiguous way possible created the conditions that made the modern Mexican nation possible. And the modern Mexican nation has, through a sustained and deliberate process of cultural negotiation, chosen not to celebrate him. Mexico's national identity is built around its indigenous heritage. The eagle and the serpent on the flag come from Aztec iconography. The Aztec calendar stone is one of the most recognizable symbols of Mexican culture worldwide. Cuauhtémoc has the monument on Paseo de la Reforma, and the great murals that Diego Rivera painted on the walls of the National Palace in the 1930s, murals that are among the most ambitious works of public art in the 20th century, depict Mesoamerican civilization in its full complexity and richness, and depict the conquest as an act of savage destruction. Cortés appears in the Rivera murals as a hunched, sickly-looking figure in the background, almost marginal to the story of which he is the central actor. This is a political choice about historical memory, and like all political choices about historical memory, it involves its own simplifications. The pre-Hispanic civilization celebrated in the murals and in the museums and in the national mythology was not a paradise. The Aztec Empire was an empire, extractive, hierarchical, violent in specific and institutionalized ways. He built on the labor of subject peoples who did not choose subjection. The Tlaxcalans who allied with Cortés were not traitors to some unified indigenous Mexico that did not exist. They were a people with their own interests, their own grievances, and their own calculations about what the future was likely to look like and how best to position themselves within it. The complexity of the indigenous present is harder to celebrate than the complexity of the indigenous past. Many indigenous communities in Mexico today, Maya, Mixtec, Zapotec, Nahuatl-speaking communities, live in conditions of poverty and political marginalization that reflect the still operating consequences of colonial exploitation. The mestizo national identity that Mexican nationalism celebrates as a synthesis can also be read as a cultural mechanism by which indigenous particularity is absorbed and homogenized, by which indigenous languages and traditions are acknowledged as heritage while being gently discouraged as living practice. The revolution against colonialism that began with independence in 1821 has not fully concluded. It has an ongoing argument about who owns the story, what Cortés tells us. Hernán Cortés was not a monster in the sense of being outside the human range. This is the most disturbing conclusion of an episode like this, and it is worth staying with for a moment, rather than rushing past it towards something more comfortable. He was a product of his civilization in the most complete sense. His civilization told him that the peoples of the New World were potential souls to be saved and potential laborers to be exploited, and that their deaths in the service of Spanish glory were not merely acceptable, but perhaps divinely ordained, evidence of God's favor toward Spain's civilizing mission. This was not the eccentric opinion of particularly cruel individuals. It was the consensus view. It was written into the law. It was preached from the pulpit. It was the framework that every Spanish colonist in the New World inhabited, and that most of them accepted not cynically, but genuinely, with the comfortable sincerity that comes from being told what you want to hear by every institution around you. Cortés was an extreme version of what his culture was producing in ordinary quantities. He had more intelligence, more ambition, and more psychological cunning, more capacity for calculated violence than most. But the values were shared. The logic was shared. The willingness to accept the deaths of millions as the price of empire. The willingness, more precisely, not even to register those deaths as a cost, but to experience them as a neutral fact of the natural order, was not his alone. It was the structural feature of the civilization he represented. There is a historian of the Holocaust named Christopher Browning who wrote a book about the men who actually did the killing in the death squads of the Eastern Front. Ordinary middle-aged German police reservists, not SS ideologues, not people selected for exceptional brutality. He called his book Ordinary Men. His conclusion, the conclusion that caused the most discomfort, was that these were not monsters. So they were ordinary people who had been placed in a structural situation where the killing of Jewish people was the expected and rewarded behavior, and who made, for the most part, ordinary human choices about how to respond to that situation. Most killed. Some tried to opt out. Almost none refused entirely. The horror, Browning argues, is not their exceptionalism. The horror is their ordinariness. This is the Cortés problem, not the horror of an exceptional monster, but the horror of what ordinary systems, ordinary ambition, ordinary faith, ordinary greed, ordinary structures of authority and reward, can produce when they are pointed in a particular direction. The system that pointed Hernán Cortés at the Aztec Empire was not a temporary aberration in an otherwise decent civilization. It was the civilization. Dan Carlin has talked in his work about the difficulty of judging historical figures by the standards of their own time versus the standards of ours. He's right that this is genuinely difficult. The people who did the worst things in history were, for the most part, operating within the moral frameworks available to them, and those frameworks did not include the ethical conclusions that we now take for granted. The question of how much weight to give to the context in which a person operated, versus the weight to give to the harm they caused regardless of context, is one that does not have a clean answer. Cortés believed he was great. He believed he was doing God's will. He believed he was serving his king and his civilization and humanity itself. And while he believed all of that, he ended a world. The world he ended was not perfect. No world is perfect. But it was real. It was people's lives, people's cities, people's religious understanding of the cosmos and their place in it, people's relationships with the land and the water and the sky. It was the accumulated achievement of 2 centuries of city building and agricultural engineering and astronomical observation and artistic production and political organization. It was a world, in the full meaning of that word, and it is gone. Some of it survives. The Nahuatl language is still spoken by more than 1 million people in Mexico. Archaeological excavations at the Templo Mayor site have been ongoing since the 1970s and have revealed the extraordinary richness of the ceremonial center that the Spanish demolished. The Florentine Codex preserves in extraordinary detail most the voices of people who survived the conquest and recorded what they had lost. The codex survived because Sahagún hid copies from the Spanish authorities who tried to destroy it. It is in a library in Florence, which is why it is called the Florentine Codex. The library in Florence, Italy, is where the memory of the Aztec world is kept, under the Metropolitan Cathedral in Mexico City, beneath the largest Spanish colonial church in the Americas, beneath 3 centuries of Catholic liturgy and the bones of archbishops and the prayers of a nation, are the ruins of the Templo Mayor. You can look down through glass windows in the plaza floor and see the stones of the pyramid below, the snakeheads, the offering pits, the worn steps, one world on top of another world, one world looking up from below. That is what Hernán Cortés built. Now, that is what he left behind. That is what it costs to be the most forward-facing man in a world of ambitious men. To never stop, to never question, to burn the ships and keep moving. That is what the future looks like, when you let it be made by people who are willing to pay any price for it, as long as the price is paid by someone else.